The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of Emma's bedroom, casting soft shadows across walls that still held the dreams of a 17-year-old girl. Posters of indie bands competed for space with photographs of friends, their faces frozen in moments of laughter that now seemed impossibly distant. A guitar case leaned against the corner, its worn leather surface bearing witness to countless hours of practice, of songs written in the safety of a room that had become both sanctuary and prison. Linda Morrison stood in the doorway, her coffee growing cold in trembling hands as she surveyed the carefully arranged chaos that had been her daughter's world. The bed was made. Emma had always been meticulous about that, but the impression of her body seemed to linger in the memory foam mattress, a ghost of presence in a space now defined by absence. The digital clock on the nightstand blinked 7:23 a.m., the same time Linda had discovered the empty room exactly 3 months ago, on that October morning when autumn had begun its slow surrender to winter. The note lay folded on the desk, its edges worn soft from repeated handling. 4 lines written in Emma's careful script. "I can't be what everyone wants me to be. The music is calling me somewhere else. Don't look for me. I need to find myself first. I love you, but I have to go." The words had been memorized, dissected, analyzed by both family and investigators, but they remained as mysterious as the girl who had written them. Detective Sarah Chen had explained that 17-year-olds in Oregon had certain rights, that Emma wasn't technically a missing person, but a runaway, and that the law tied their hands in ways that felt like betrayal to a mother's heart. The technical distinctions mattered little when weighed against the silence that had settled over the Morrison household like dust on abandoned furniture. Emma's father, Michael, had thrown himself into his work at the paper mill with the desperate energy of a man running from his own reflection. Their marriage, once steady as the Oregon pines that surrounded their small town of Millbrook, had begun to show stress fractures that widened with each passing day. The community had rallied initially, as small towns do when one of their own goes missing. Missing person flyers appeared on telephone poles and coffee shop bulletin boards, Emma's senior portrait smiling from beneath the bold-lettered word, "Missing." Local news stations covered the story for a week, interviewing classmates who described Emma as talented but troubled, a girl who seemed to carry music in her soul and sadness in her eyes. Her high school friends spoke of her dreams of Nashville, of making it as a singer-songwriter, but also of the pressure she felt to follow the path her parents had envisioned: college, a stable career, a life mapped out in safe, predictable increments. But as weeks turned to months, the immediate urgency faded into the background rhythm of daily life. The flyers became weather-beaten and forgotten, eventually removed by city workers, or covered by advertisements for yard sales and lost pets. The investigation grew cold, relegated to a file that Detective Chen would pull out periodically, adding new information that led nowhere, pursuing leads that dissolved like morning mist. Emma had taken her guitar, her grandmother's silver locket, and exactly $847 from her college savings account, enough to disappear but not enough to disappear comfortably. Her cell phone had been left behind, its screen cracked from when she'd dropped it the week before, the device now silent on her desk, like an artifact from a previous life. The last transaction on her debit card had been at a Greyhound station in Portland, 127 miles from home, where security cameras showed a figure in a hooded sweatshirt purchasing a ticket with cash. The destination remained unknown, the footage too grainy to confirm it was Emma, though Linda's heart recognized the way the figure held her shoulders, slightly hunched as if carrying invisible weight. The seasons changed around the empty room, spring bringing new growth that Emma would never see from her bedroom window, summer painting the walls with different patterns of light and shadow. Linda found herself sitting in her daughter's room more frequently as time passed, not from hope of her return, but from a need to remember what it felt like when the house held the sound of Emma's voice, her laughter, the gentle strumming of guitar strings in the evening hours. If stories like this move you to believe in the persistence of love across impossible distances, you might want to subscribe, because sometimes the most profound journeys begin with a single step into the unknown. The town's memory of Emma Morrison began its slow fade, her disappearance becoming part of Millbrook's folklore, a cautionary tale told to other parents of teenage dreamers. But in the bedroom where morning light continued to filter through gauze curtains, time remained suspended, waiting for a melody that might never come home. 6 months after Emma's disappearance, Michael Morrison's hands had developed permanent calluses from gripping the steering wheel of his truck during weekend searches that took him further and further from Oregon. His methodical mind, trained by years of shift work at the mill, had created a system, printing Google Street View images of cities along the Greyhound routes, marking hostels, music venues, and coffee shops where a young girl with a guitar might seek refuge or opportunity. Nashville, Austin, Denver, Portland. He followed the threads of America's musical underground, like a detective pursuing a ghost. Linda had stopped accompanying him after their third fruitless trip to Seattle, where they'd spent 48 hours walking through Pike Place Market and Capitol Hill, showing Emma's photograph to buskers and baristas, who offered sympathy but no recognition. The strain of hope repeatedly crushed had worn grooves in their marriage deeper than the worry lines that now mapped their faces. While Michael searched the external world, Linda began excavating their daughter's internal landscape, reading through Emma's journals, her song lyrics, her school essays, searching for clues in the archaeology of a troubled young woman's thoughts. What she found painted a picture of a girl caught between worlds, dutiful daughter and artistic dreamer, small-town stability and big-city possibility. Emma's songs, scrawled in notebooks and saved as voice memos on her laptop, spoke of feeling like a caged bird, of melodies that called from distant horizons, of the suffocating weight of expectations wrapped in love. One lyric, written just weeks before her disappearance, haunted Linda's sleepless nights. They build you a house of their dreams, but the walls are made of their fears, and you can't sing through concrete and tears. The police investigation had stalled after the initial months, hampered by Emma's legal status as an adult runaway and the vast geography of possibilities. Detective Chen maintained contact with the family, adding Emma's information to national databases and following up on occasional leads that inevitably led nowhere. A girl matching Emma's description had been spotted in a Denver coffee shop playing guitar for tips. Another sighting placed her in a Nashville recording studio, though security footage proved it was someone else entirely. Each false lead carved deeper wounds in the Morrison family's collective heart. Emma's high school friends graduated without her, their social media posts a painful reminder of the life she'd abandoned. Her best friend, Mia, visited Linda regularly that first year, bringing stories of college applications and senior dances, but even she eventually found the weight of absence too heavy to bear. The natural rhythm of young life carried her classmates forward, while Emma remained frozen at 17 in her family's memory, untouched by the passage of time that aged everyone around her. The music community in Millbrook, small as it was, had embraced the search with particular fervor. Local musicians organized benefit concerts, donating proceeds to a fund that helped finance Michael's increasingly desperate expeditions. The high school music teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who had recognized Emma's talent early and encouraged her songwriting, became an unofficial coordinator of musical venues across the Pacific Northwest, sending Emma's photograph and recordings to booking agents and venue owners who might remember a young girl with an old soul and a voice that could break hearts. But the West Coast music scene was vast and fluid, filled with transient young artists chasing dreams on shoestring budgets, sleeping on couches and in hostels, their faces blending into the anonymous crowd of hopefuls who arrived daily in cities that promised everything and guaranteed nothing. Emma, if she had indeed gone west, would have been one of thousands, her talent substantial but not yet distinctive enough to generate the kind of notice that might have led her home. As autumn returned to Oregon, marking the first anniversary of Emma's disappearance, the initial urgency had settled into a different kind of grief, not the sharp pain of fresh loss, but the dull ache of chronic absence. The bedroom remained unchanged, but it no longer felt like a shrine so much as a museum, preserving the artifacts of a life interrupted rather than a life paused. Michael's searches became less frequent, but more focused, following leads from private investigators he'd hired with money borrowed against the house. Linda returned to work part-time at the library, finding solace in the quiet organization of other people's stories, while her own remained unfinished. The anniversary brought renewed media attention, a local news feature that rehashed the known facts and appealed for new information. A few calls came in, always a few calls came in, but Detective Chen's experienced ear could distinguish between genuine leads and the well-meaning confusion of people who wanted to help but had nothing substantial to offer. The case file grew thicker but no clearer, filled with dead ends and false hopes that had been pursued and abandoned. In the evening quiet of their hollowed-out home, Linda and Michael began to speak of Emma in the past tense, though neither acknowledged the grammatical shift that marked their unconscious acceptance of a truth too terrible to speak aloud. The search continued, but it had transformed from a rescue mission into something closer to an archaeological expedition, seeking not a living daughter, but answers to questions that grew more complex with each passing season. By the second year, Emma Morrison had become a story that Millbrook told about itself, a reminder of how quickly the familiar could become foreign, how a girl could walk out of her room one October morning and vanish into the vast American landscape as completely as if she had never existed. The initial intensity of the search had given way to a more sustainable but equally painful routine of periodic efforts and chronic hope, punctuated by the small cruelties of false alarms and mistaken identities. Detective Chen had seen enough missing persons cases to recognize the pattern: the frantic first months, the gradual acceptance, the way families learned to live with questions that had no answers. She kept Emma's file active, following up on leads that filtered through the national databases, but the trail had gone cold in those first weeks when Emma had purchased her bus ticket and stepped into anonymity. The girl had planned her disappearance well enough to avoid the digital breadcrumbs that might have led investigators to her door, and the music industry's informal economy of cash payments and shared resources provided perfect camouflage for someone who wanted to remain hidden. Michael's weekend searches had evolved into something more strategic and desperate. He'd learned the geography of American desperation, the cities where young people collected like sediment in the wake of broken dreams. He could navigate the hostels of Austin, the rehearsal spaces of Nashville, the coffee shops of Denver where musicians gathered to trade stories and opportunities. His truck bore the accumulated dust of a dozen states, and his wallet carried photographs worn soft from handling. Emma at her high school talent show, Emma with her first guitar, Emma laughing in the backyard on a summer evening that now seemed impossibly distant. The financial strain of the search had begun to show in ways both large and small. The private investigators had been dismissed after 6 months of expensive reports that contained more speculation than fact. The second mortgage on the house provided funding for Michael's travels, but Linda watched their savings disappear into the American highway system with growing anxiety. Her part-time library job had become full-time by necessity, though she found it difficult to concentrate on the mundane tasks of checking out books and organizing returns, when her mind remained focused on the one story that refused to resolve itself. Emma's absence had reshaped not just her family, but the entire community's understanding of itself. Millbrook had always been the kind of place where people looked out for each other, where teenagers might rebel but rarely vanished entirely. The knowledge that one of their own had simply walked away challenged assumptions about the town's ability to hold and nurture its young people. Parents found themselves having different conversations with their own teenagers, asking harder questions about happiness and dreams, trying to distinguish between normal adolescent angst and the deeper discontent that might lead to flight. The high school had established a memorial scholarship in Emma's name, though the term memorial felt premature and somehow inappropriate for someone who might still be alive. Mrs. Patterson, the music teacher, had advocated for calling it the Emma Morrison Music Dreams Fund, supporting students who wanted to pursue musical education beyond Millbrook's limited resources. Each year, a graduating senior would receive money to attend music camps or purchase equipment, a small recognition of talents that might otherwise remain hidden in the shadows of small-town expectations. Linda had begun attending a support group for families of missing persons, driving 40 minutes to Portland once a week to sit in a circle with other people who understood the peculiar grief of loving someone whose fate remained unknown. The group included parents of children who had been missing for decades, their faces bearing the particular wear that comes from years of hoping without resolution. Linda learned the vocabulary of ambiguous loss, the way trauma could freeze a family in time while the world moved forward around them. The second Christmas without Emma had been observed rather than celebrated, the family going through the motions of traditions that felt hollow without her presence. Her stocking remained hung by the fireplace, empty but hopeful, while the guitar case in her room gathered dust like a monument to abandoned dreams. Linda found herself buying Emma a present, a new set of guitar strings, and wrapping it carefully before placing it under the tree, a ritual that acknowledged both presence and absence in equal measure. Social media had become both blessing and curse in the search for Emma. Facebook groups dedicated to finding missing persons shared her photograph regularly, generating occasional leads and constant false hope. Linda monitored these platforms obsessively, following every shared post and comment, reaching out to people who claimed to have seen someone matching Emma's description. Most leads evaporated under scrutiny, but the possibility of connection kept her scrolling through endless feeds of missing faces, each one representing another family's fractured world. The music community's support had also evolved, becoming more organized but less urgent as the second year progressed. Benefit concerts continued, but they had transformed from desperate fundraising efforts into annual remembrance events that served as much to comfort the community as to aid the search. Emma's recorded songs, preserved on her laptop and shared with permission, had gained a small following among local musicians who covered her compositions and posted them online with hashtags like Find Emma and Munank Bring Her Home. As spring returned to Oregon for the second time since Emma's disappearance, the cherry trees bloomed again in the Morrison backyard, their beauty a painful reminder of the cycles that continued regardless of human suffering. Linda found herself gardening more deliberately, planting perennials that would bloom for years to come, a quiet act of faith that someone would be there to see them flower. The seasons had become markers not of time's passage, but of time's persistence, each changing month another step away from the daughter who remained 17 in memory, but would now be 19 in reality, shaped by experiences her family could only imagine. 8 years had passed since Emma Morrison walked out of her childhood bedroom and into the American landscape, 8 years during which the sharp edges of her absence had worn smooth like stones in a river. Linda Morrison's hair had gone completely grey, though she still kept it long the way Emma used to insist, made her look younger. Michael's weekend searches had dwindled to occasional 3-day expeditions, usually triggered by a particularly compelling lead or the anniversary of her disappearance. Their marriage had survived the crisis, but bore scars like a tree that grows around a fence, adapting to the foreign object that had become part of its essential structure. The town of Millbrook had grown around Emma's absence too, new families moving in who knew nothing of the girl who had vanished, teenagers attending the high school who saw her memorial photograph in the trophy case without connecting it to any living memory. Mrs. Patterson had retired, replaced by a younger music teacher who played Emma's recorded songs for her classes as examples of student achievement, though the story behind them had become local legend rather than immediate reality. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September when Marcus Rodriguez's phone buzzed with a notification that would change everything. Marcus had been in Austin for 3 days, filming content for his YouTube channel where he documented street musicians across America. His subscriber count had grown steadily over the past 2 years as he'd developed a reputation for finding extraordinary talent in unexpected places. His gentle interview style and genuine appreciation for music creating a following among people who believed in art's power to transcend circumstance. The notification was from his editor, Jenna, whose job involved sifting through the hours of footage Marcus shot in each city, cutting together the pieces that would become his weekly videos. But this message contained an urgency that was unusual for their typically professional correspondence. "You need to see this immediately. I think we found something impossible." Marcus had been walking down 6th Street that morning, his camera capturing the eclectic mix of musicians who made Austin's music scene legendary, when he'd paused to film a young woman sitting on a corner with an acoustic guitar. She couldn't have been older than 25, with shoulder-length brown hair that caught the Texas sunlight and a voice that seemed to carry more weight than her small frame should have been able to support. Her guitar case lay open in front of her, sparse donations suggesting that passers-by were more interested in their destinations than her music. But Marcus's trained ear had recognized something extraordinary in the melody drifting from her corner. She'd been singing an original song, something haunting and beautiful about lost connections and the weight of choices, her fingers moving across the strings with the kind of precision that spoke of years of practice. Marcus had filmed for several minutes, captivated by the way she seemed completely absorbed in her music, oblivious to the foot traffic streaming past her on the busy street. When she'd finished the song, he'd approached to ask about an interview, but she'd packed up quickly, mumbling something about needing to get to work, and disappeared into the crowd before he could offer the $100 payment he typically gave to featured musicians. Jenna's editing process typically took several days, but something about the Austin footage had compelled her to work through the night, cutting together the various performances Marcus had captured. It was during the color correction phase, when she was adjusting the brightness and contrast of the young woman's performance, that she'd noticed something that made her hands shake as she reached for her phone. "Marcus," she'd said when he answered, her voice tight with an emotion he couldn't identify, "what do you know about missing persons cases?" The question had seemed random until Jenna explained her process. She'd become curious about the young woman's distinctive voice and had decided to search online for any existing recordings, thinking she might be a professional musician Marcus hadn't recognized. Instead, her search had led her to a missing person website where she'd found a photograph that stopped her heart. Emma Morrison, missing since 2012, last seen in Oregon, believed to be pursuing music. "The bone structure is identical," Jenna had explained, her voice gaining strength as she walked Marcus through her analysis. "The eyes, The way she holds her mouth when she sings, even the way she positions her hands on the guitar. It's the same person, Marcus. I'm absolutely certain. Marcus had initially been skeptical. Missing persons cases generated false hope regularly, and the desire to see patterns often overcame objective analysis. But as Jenna sent him screenshot comparisons between his footage and Emma's missing person photographs, the resemblance became impossible to dismiss. The woman he'd filmed bore the unmistakable markers of someone who'd lived rough for years. The careful way she guarded her possessions, the weathered quality of her clothing, the hyper-vigilant glances at passers-by. But underneath the accumulated wear of street life was the face of Emma Morrison, aged by time and circumstance but fundamentally unchanged. The ethical implications of the discovery had kept Marcus awake for the past 2 nights. His channel's success was built on celebrating street musicians, not exploiting them, and he'd never used his platform to intrude on someone's privacy. But Emma Morrison represented something different, not just a story, but a family's answered prayer, a mystery that could finally find resolution. The footage he'd captured might represent the first confirmed sighting of Emma in 8 years, the breakthrough that could reunite her with parents who had never stopped searching. Marcus had spent hours researching Emma's case online, reading through news articles and social media posts that chronicled her family's desperate search. He'd watched interview footage of Linda and Michael Morrison, their faces etched with the particular pain of parents whose child had chosen to disappear. The music Emma had recorded in high school, preserved on YouTube by friends and family, matched the vocal timbre and guitar style of the woman he'd filmed on 6th Street with uncanny precision. The decision to reach out to the Morrison family had required careful consideration of both ethics and consequences. Marcus understood that his footage might represent false hope, that resemblances could be coincidental, that 8 years of desperate searching had probably generated dozens of similar possibilities that had led nowhere. But the certainty in Jenna's voice, combined with his own growing conviction as he studied the footage, had convinced him that silence would be a greater cruelty than contact. He'd found Linda Morrison's phone number through the missing person website and had called on a Wednesday evening, his hands trembling as he dialed. The conversation had been brief and careful, Marcus explaining who he was, describing what he'd filmed, offering to send the footage for the family's review. Linda's voice had broken when she'd agreed to look at the video, 8 years of accumulated hope and disappointment condensed into a whispered, "Yes, please." The video file Marcus sent that evening would travel across the country in seconds, carrying with it the possibility that Emma Morrison's 8-year journey through America's margins might finally lead her home. Linda Morrison's hands shook so violently she could barely control the laptop mouse as she clicked on the video file Marcus Rodriguez had sent. 8 years of false leads had taught her to manage expectations, to view each potential sighting with careful skepticism, but something in the young filmmaker's voice had suggested this was different. Michael sat beside her on their living room couch, his reading glasses reflecting the screen's glow as they prepared to watch footage that might contain their first glimpse of Emma in nearly a decade. The video began with typical street scene sounds, traffic, conversation, the ambient noise of a city in motion. Marcus's camera panned across Austin's 6th Street before settling on a figure sitting cross-legged on a sidewalk corner, guitar in her lap, a small cardboard sign propped against her case that read "Original Songs Tips Appreciated." The woman's face was initially obscured by the angle and the fall of her hair, but when she looked up to acknowledge a passerby who'd dropped coins into her case, Linda's breath caught in her throat. The years had changed Emma's face in subtle ways. Her cheekbones were more pronounced, her skin bearing the weathered quality of someone who'd spent considerable time outdoors, and there was a wariness in her eyes that hadn't existed in high school. But the fundamental architecture of her features remained unchanged. The delicate curve of her jaw, the way her left eyebrow arched slightly higher than her right, the distinctive shape of her hands as they moved across the guitar strings. "My God," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of Emma's singing. "That's our daughter." The song Emma performed in the video was one Linda had never heard, a haunting melody about wandering and searching, about the weight of choices and the price of freedom. Her voice had matured since high school, gaining depth and resonance that spoke of experiences beyond her family's imagination. She sang with her eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music. And for a moment, Linda could see the 17-year-old who had practiced for hours in her bedroom, lost in the world that existed between lyrics and melody. Linda watched the 4-minute video 17 times that first evening, each viewing revealing new details that confirmed what her heart had recognized immediately. The way Emma tucked her hair behind her left ear when concentrating, a gesture she'd made since childhood. The small scar on her chin from a bicycle accident when she was 12, barely visible but unmistakable to a mother's eye. The distinctive way she held her guitar pick, gripped between thumb and forefinger with her middle finger, providing support. Exactly as Mrs. Patterson had taught her years ago, the implications of the discovery overwhelmed Linda with their complexity. Emma was alive, healthy enough to perform music, but living on the streets of Austin in circumstances that spoke of struggles her family could only guess at. The cardboard sign suggested she was earning money through her performances, but the sparse collection in her guitar case indicated that survival was likely a daily challenge. The Emma in the video looked thin, her clothing worn and carefully maintained, her possessions few but clearly precious. Michael had immediately wanted to drive to Austin, to search every street corner until they found her, but Linda's 8 years of disappointment had taught her caution. They'd had confirmed sightings before, or what had seemed like confirmed sightings, that had led to heartbreak when investigated further. But this felt different, not just because of the visual evidence, but because of the music itself. Emma's songwriting style was as distinctive as her fingerprints, and the melody she performed in Marcus's video bore all the hallmarks of her compositional voice. Detective Chen, now a lieutenant with the Portland Police, had agreed to review the footage and coordinate with Austin authorities to investigate the lead. Her experienced skepticism was tempered by the quality of the evidence Marcus had provided. High-definition video taken in good lighting conditions, multiple angles of the subject's face, and audio clear enough to analyze vocal patterns. She'd worked missing persons cases long enough to recognize the difference between wishful thinking and legitimate identification. The next 48 hours passed in a suspension of normal time, as various authorities reviewed the footage and prepared to investigate. Marcus had returned to the 6th Street corner, where he'd filmed Emma, hoping to find her performing again, but the location remained empty on subsequent visits. Street musicians were transient by nature, moving between locations based on foot traffic, police presence, and dozens of other factors that outsiders couldn't predict. Linda found herself unable to concentrate on anything except the video, watching it obsessively, while Michael paced their living room like a caged animal. The confirmation that Emma was alive should have brought relief, but instead it generated new anxieties about her circumstances and well-being. The young woman in the video looked like someone who'd learned to be invisible, to take up minimal space in a world that hadn't made room for her dreams. 8 years of wondering where Emma might be had been replaced by the more complex question of who she'd become during her time away. The Austin Police Department had assigned Detective Maria Santos to investigate the lead, and her initial report was both encouraging and frustrating. She'd visited the location where Marcus filmed Emma, but found no one matching her description. Interviews with other street musicians in the area had generated conflicting information. Some remembered a young woman with a guitar who'd performed in the downtown area, but descriptions varied, and no one could provide reliable information about her current whereabouts or regular schedule. Marcus had shared additional footage from his Austin trip, hours of raw material that might contain other glimpses of Emma or clues about her circumstances. Linda watched every frame, searching for background details that might indicate where Emma lived or worked when she wasn't performing. The investigation had taken on the methodical quality of detective work, each piece of evidence examined for the information it might reveal about Emma's life on Austin's margins. Social media had amplified the search in ways both helpful and problematic. Marcus's video had been shared thousands of times, generating widespread attention, but also dozens of false sightings and well-meaning interference from amateur investigators. The Austin music community had embraced the search, with local musicians sharing Emma's photograph and the video footage across their networks, asking people to watch for her at venues and performance spaces throughout the city. As the investigation entered its second week, Linda began to understand that finding Emma would be more complex than simply locating her physically. The young woman in Marcus's video had clearly built a life independent of her family, developed survival skills and relationships that existed entirely outside their knowledge. Reunion, if it came, would require navigating 8 years of separate experiences and growth, bridging the gap between the girl who'd left Millbrook and the woman who now made her living singing on Austin street corners. The bedroom that had remained unchanged for 8 years suddenly felt like an inadequate shrine to someone who'd continued living and growing beyond its walls. Emma Morrison was no longer the 17-year-old frozen in her family's memory, but a 25-year-old woman whose story had chapters her parents had never read. Detective Maria Santos had spent 15 years working the streets of Austin, long enough to understand the invisible geography that governed where transient populations moved and settled. Street musicians like the woman in Marcus Rodriguez's video typically followed patterns, performing in high-traffic areas during peak hours, retreating to quieter neighborhoods during enforcement sweeps, gathering in spots where the music community offered mutual protection and information sharing. Finding someone who'd learned to live invisibly required understanding the city from the ground up. Her investigation had begun with the systematic canvass of downtown Austin's performance areas, but Emma Morrison had proven as elusive in person as she'd been for the past 8 years. Santos had learned to recognize the particular wariness that street performers developed toward authority figures, the way conversations would shift when she identified herself as police, information becoming scarce and descriptions deliberately vague. The community that supported Austin's buskers also protected them, and Emma had apparently earned the loyalty that came with being accepted into that world. Linda Morrison's phone calls to the Austin Police Department had become daily occurrences, her desperation palpable even through long-distance conversations. Santos understood the family's urgency. 8 years of searching had culminated in confirmed proof of life, making Emma's continued elusiveness feel like a cruel extension of their suffering. But street people moved like water, flowing around obstacles and changing course when pressure was applied, and direct police involvement often drove them deeper underground. Marcus Rodriguez had become an unofficial partner in the investigation, his access to the music community providing insights that traditional police work couldn't generate. He'd established relationships with other street musicians who'd known Emma by the name she used in Austin, Melody, a painfully obvious pseudonym that nonetheless had protected her identity for years. Marcus learned that Emma performed regularly but sporadically, appearing at different locations based on weather, crowd size, and the complex social dynamics that governed territory and performance rights among Austin's buskers. The picture that emerged of Emma's life in Austin was both reassuring and heartbreaking. She'd survived 8 years on society's margins through a combination of musical talent, careful resource management, and the informal support networks that existed within the city's artistic underground. She lived in a series of shared housing situations, sometimes couch surfing with other musicians, occasionally staying in hostels or extended-stay motels when money allowed, and during harsh weather, sleeping in her car, a battered Honda Civic she'd purchased with cash years earlier. Emma's Austin identity was carefully constructed to avoid detection, while maintaining the connections necessary for survival. She'd never applied for government benefits or services that might generate official records, instead relying on the cash economy that sustained much of the city's music scene. She performed not just as a busker, but occasionally at open mic nights and small venues, always under her assumed name, building a modest reputation among local musicians who knew her only as Melody, the quiet songwriter with the haunting voice who'd been part of Austin's scene for years. The breakthrough came through Marcus's patient cultivation of trust within the busking community. A fellow street musician named Jake, who'd known Emma for 3 years, finally agreed to help locate her after Marcus explained the situation and showed him photographs of Linda and Michael Morrison. Jake's description of Emma's life revealed both resilience and profound sadness. She was talented enough to have pursued music professionally, but seemed to actively avoid opportunities that might increase her visibility or require background checks. "She's scared of something," Jake had told Marcus during their conversation at a coffee shop near the University of Texas campus. "Not like danger scared, but like she's afraid of being found. Whenever anyone asks personal questions, she changes the subject. I always figured she was running from something bad, but maybe she's just running from home." Jake's willingness to help was motivated by genuine concern for Emma's well-being. He'd watched her struggle through Austin's harsh summers and cold winters, seen her juggle the constant stress of finding safe places to sleep and consistent opportunities to earn money. He'd also noticed changes in her recently. She seemed more anxious, more isolated, as if the weight of maintaining her hidden identity was becoming harder to bear. The plan they developed was delicate and respectful of Emma's autonomy. Rather than orchestrating a confrontation or surprise encounter, Marcus would approach her during one of her performances with Jake's introduction and moral support. He would explain who he was, show her the video he'd taken, and let her know that her family was looking for her. The decision about contact would be entirely Emma's, with no pressure or manipulation beyond the simple knowledge that 8 years of silence had ended. Jake knew Emma's general schedule and preferred locations, information he'd gathered through years of friendship and shared experience. She typically performed on weekend afternoons in the area around South Congress, moving between several spots based on crowd flow and competition from other musicians. Her timing was predictable enough that Jake felt confident they could find her, but her wariness meant they'd have only one opportunity to approach her before she might disappear again. Detective Santos had mixed feelings about the plan. Her professional instincts favored more direct action, but her experience with runaway cases had taught her that forced reunions often failed, driving the missing person deeper underground and making future contact even less likely. Emma Morrison had survived 8 years of independence, had built a life that worked within her parameters, and deserved the dignity of choice about whether to reconnect with her family. Linda Morrison's response to the plan was complex. Relief at the prospect of contact, tempered by anxiety about Emma's potential rejection. 8 years of hoping for reunion had perhaps not prepared her for the possibility that Emma might choose to remain estranged, that the girl who'd left home might have become a woman who preferred the life she'd built to the one she'd abandoned. The upcoming approach would test not just Emma's willingness to reconnect, but the Morrison family's ability to accept whatever decision she made. Marcus spent the days before the planned approach reviewing everything he'd learned about Emma's Austin life, preparing for a conversation that might determine whether 8 years of searching would end in reunion or in the more complex resolution of confirmed choice. The young woman singing on 6th Street had looked both lost and found, and Marcus understood that approaching her meant potentially disrupting an equilibrium that had sustained her through years of difficulty. Saturday morning arrived with the clarity of Texas autumn, the kind of weather that brought people outdoors and filled Austin's streets with the energy that made the city's music scene legendary. Marcus met Jake at a predetermined location, both men carrying the weight of responsibility for a moment that could change multiple lives. Somewhere in the streets ahead, Emma Morrison was preparing for another day of making music for strangers, unaware that her 8-year anonymity was about to end. The South Congress Bridge was casting long shadows across the sidewalk when Marcus Rodriguez spotted her, guitar case open at her feet, singing to a small crowd of tourists who'd paused on their way to whatever authentic Austin experience they were seeking. Emma Morrison, though she'd been Melody for so long that she sometimes forgot her original name, was performing a song Marcus recognized from his research, one she'd written in high school but had modified over the years, the lyrics now carrying weight that came from lived experience rather than adolescent imagination. Jake approached first, his familiar presence ensuring that Emma wouldn't immediately pack up and disappear. Marcus hung back, camera deliberately tucked away, understanding that this moment required human connection rather than documentation. From his position 30 feet away, he could see the years that had accumulated in Emma's posture, the way she held herself slightly apart from the crowd, ready to move if circumstances required it, the careful attention she paid to her surroundings even while lost in her music. When Emma finished her song and the small crowd dispersed, dropping bills and coins into her case with the casual generosity of people on vacation, Jake sat down beside her on the low wall that bordered the sidewalk area. Marcus watched their conversation from a distance, noting the way Emma's body language shifted from relaxed to alert as Jake spoke, her eyes scanning the area until they found Marcus and held his gaze across the space that separated them. The recognition was instant and mutual. Marcus saw the moment Emma understood who he was and why he was there, her face cycling through emotions he could read even from 30 feet away, surprise, fear, resignation, and something that might have been relief. She closed her eyes briefly, her hands still gripping her guitar as if it were an anchor in suddenly turbulent water, and when she opened them again, she nodded slightly toward Marcus, granting permission for an approach that would end 8 years of anonymity. Walking those 30 feet felt like crossing a continent. Marcus was acutely aware of carrying the hopes and fears of the Morrison family, of Detective Santos's investigation, of his own responsibility as the person who'd accidentally discovered Emma and set these events in motion. But mostly, he was aware of the young woman sitting on the wall, watching his approach with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to evaluate threats and opportunities with equal precision. "Hello, Emma," he said when he reached her, his voice gentle but clear enough to acknowledge that pretense was no longer possible. "My name is Marcus Rodriguez. I think you know why I'm here." Emma's first words in 8 years to someone who knew her real identity were barely whisper. "How long have you known?" Her voice carried the same haunting quality that had captivated him in his original footage, but now it was layered with exhaustion and something that sounded like acceptance of inevitability. Marcus sat down on the wall, leaving space between them, respecting the boundaries that Emma's body language clearly established. "About 2 weeks," he said. "I filmed you performing here, and my editor recognized you from missing person websites. Your parents have been looking for you. The mention of her parents caused Emma to flinch, a physical reaction that suggested the wound of separation hadn't healed despite the years. She stared at her guitar, her fingers moving unconsciously across the strings without producing sound, a nervous habit that Marcus recognized from his footage of other street musicians dealing with stress. "Are they here?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible over the street noise around them. "No," Marcus assured her. "They're in Oregon. They don't know I've found you yet. I wanted to talk to you first, to let you decide what happens next." The relief in Emma's shoulders was visible, the tension releasing slightly as she processed the information that she wasn't about to be confronted by the family she'd spent 8 years avoiding. Jake remained nearby but silent, providing moral support through presence rather than words, understanding that the conversation needed to belong to Emma and Marcus. "Why?" Emma asked, finally looking directly at Marcus. "Why did you look for me? Why not just delete the video and pretend you never saw me?" The question revealed the heart of Emma's 8-year flight, the belief that disappearance was preferable to the complications of connection, that anonymity provided safety, that engagement could not. Marcus chose his words carefully, understanding that Emma's future might depend on how she interpreted his motivations. "Because your mother cries every time someone mentions your name," he said simply. "Because your father has driven hundreds of thousands of miles looking for you. Because your disappearance created a hole in the world that only you can fill." Emma's composure cracked slightly, tears forming in her eyes as she absorbed the reality of her family's 8 years of searching. "You don't understand," she said, her voice gaining strength as she struggled to explain herself. "I couldn't be what they wanted me to be. The pressure, the expectations, the way they looked at me like I was supposed to save them from their own disappointments. I had to leave." Marcus nodded, understanding that Emma's flight had been about more than teenage rebellion or musical ambition. "But you were 17, he said gently. "You were a child trying to solve adult problems by running away from them. Maybe things could be different now." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, Emma gradually revealing pieces of her Austin life, the struggle to survive, the loneliness of maintaining false identity, the way she'd built a community among people who accepted her without demanding explanations. She spoke of the music she'd written, the experiences that had shaped her into someone different from the girl who'd left Millbrook, the fear that returning home would mean erasing the person she'd become. Jake eventually joined the conversation, sharing his perspective on Emma's character and resilience, vouching for her strength, while also acknowledging the toll that 8 years of hiding had taken on her mental and emotional health. His friendship provided context for Emma's Austin life, revealing someone who'd survived through talent and determination, but had never stopped being haunted by the relationships she'd left behind. As afternoon shifted toward evening, Emma made her decision with the same quiet determination that had sustained her through 8 years of independence. "I need to see them," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I need to explain why I left, and I need to find out if there's still room in their lives for who I've become." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized that his accidental discovery had set in motion a reunion that could heal 8 years of wounds or create new ones. Emma Morrison had survived her disappearance, but the real test of her journey was just beginning. The young woman who'd learned to live as Melody would now have to discover whether Emma could find a way home. The plane descended through Oregon's familiar cloud cover on a Tuesday morning in early November, the landscape below painted in the muted colors of approaching winter. Emma Morrison pressed her face to the small window, watching the geography of her childhood emerge from the mist, the Columbia River, the evergreen forests, the patchwork of farmland that surrounded the town she'd fled 8 years ago. Her hands shook as she gripped the armrests, not from fear of flying, but from the magnitude of what awaited her on the ground. Marcus Rodriguez sat beside her, his presence providing the moral support that had sustained her through 3 days of preparation in Austin. The decision to return had been easier than the logistics of actually coming home. Emma had no identification beyond a fake ID she'd used for years, no official record of her existence since disappearing at 17. Detective Santos had worked with Oregon authorities to facilitate her travel, providing documentation that acknowledged both her missing person status and her voluntary return. The past week had been a whirlwind of phone calls and careful negotiations, Marcus serving as intermediary between Emma and the family she'd spent 8 years avoiding. Linda Morrison's voice on the phone had broken Emma's heart. Older, more fragile than she remembered, but filled with love that hadn't diminished despite the years of silence. Michael's conversation had been more difficult, his hurt and confusion evident, even as he tried to express joy at her safety and desire for reunion. Emma had insisted on returning gradually, staying initially with Marcus's cousin in Portland rather than immediately rejoining her family in Millbrook. The 40 miles between Portland and her hometown would provide space to process the reunion, room to breathe if the emotions became overwhelming. She'd also insisted that the reunion be private, away from the media attention that Marcus's video had generated across social media platforms and missing person networks. The Portland airport felt surreal after 8 years of avoiding places that required identification or created official records of her presence. Emma moved through the terminal with the hypervigilance that had become second nature during her Austin years, though now she was watching for familiar faces rather than threats. Her single suitcase contained everything she owned: her guitar, a few changes of clothes, the notebooks filled with songs she'd written during her years away, and her grandmother's silver locket, the only physical connection to her family that she'd carried throughout her disappearance. Linda and Michael Morrison waited in the pickup area, standing together with the awkward closeness of people who'd shared trauma but processed it differently. Linda clutched a photograph of Emma at 17, though she'd studied Marcus's video footage enough to prepare herself for the changes 8 years had wrought. Michael's hands were empty, clenched into fists that spoke of barely contained emotion: joy, anger, relief, and confusion, all competing for expression. The recognition was instant and devastating. Emma emerged from the terminal looking exactly like the young woman in Marcus's video, older, thinner, more careful in her movements, but unmistakably their daughter. Linda's sob was audible across the parking area, and she took several steps forward before stopping, suddenly uncertain about protocol for reuniting with a child who'd chosen to disappear. Emma's approach was measured, her musician's training helping her read the emotional temperature of the reunion and adjust accordingly. She stopped about 10 feet from her parents, close enough for conversation, but far enough to maintain personal space if the interaction became overwhelming. The 8-year-old conversation that had never concluded hung in the air between them. "Hello, Mum, Dad." Emma's voice was steady but soft, carrying the same musical quality that had defined her childhood, but now layered with experiences her parents could only imagine. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come home." Linda closed the distance between them with 3 quick steps, pulling Emma into an embrace that was 8 years in the making. Emma's initial stiffness melted as she returned the hug, both women crying with the release of emotions that had been carefully controlled for nearly a decade. Michael joined them after a moment's hesitation, his arms encircling both his wife and daughter in a family embrace that felt both familiar and foreign. The drive to Portland was filled with the careful conversation of people learning to know each other again. Emma shared edited versions of her Austin experiences, the music scene, the friends she'd made, the survival skills she'd developed, while Linda and Michael offered updates on Millbrook, mutual friends, the ways their lives had changed during her absence. The deeper conversations about why she'd left and why she'd stayed away were postponed by mutual consent, everyone understanding that 8 years of separation couldn't be processed in a single car ride. Marcus's cousin Sarah had prepared her guest room with the kind of thoughtful attention that spoke of understanding the magnitude of Emma's situation. The space was comfortable but not overwhelming, furnished simply but with clear respect for Emma's need for privacy and space to process her return. Emma spent her first evening in Oregon writing in her journal, trying to capture the complex emotions of coming home to a place that felt both familiar and completely changed. The reunion dinner the following evening took place at a small restaurant in downtown Portland, neutral territory that allowed for conversation without the emotional weight of family homes and childhood memories. Emma had asked that the meal be small, just her parents and Marcus, who'd earned his place in the reunion through his role in bringing them together. The conversation gradually moved beyond safe topics as the evening progressed, touching on the wounds that Emma's disappearance had created and the growth that had occurred during their separation. Emma explained her reasons for leaving with the emotional intelligence of someone who'd spent 8 years processing teenage trauma. The pressure to be perfect, to fulfill her parents' dreams for her future, had felt suffocating at 17. College applications, career planning, the assumption that her life would follow a predetermined path had triggered a panic response that flight seemed the only way to resolve. She'd intended to stay away only long enough to figure out who she was without the weight of others' expectations, but days had become weeks, weeks had become months, and eventually the gap had seemed too wide to bridge. Linda and Michael listened with the careful attention of parents, trying to understand how their love had been experienced as pressure, how their hopes for Emma's future had felt like constraints on her present. The conversation was painful but necessary, creating space for forgiveness and understanding that hadn't existed when Emma was 17 and desperate for independence. The discussion of Emma's future was more complex. She'd built a life in Austin that worked within her parameters, had developed relationships and routines that provided stability and purpose. But she'd also spent 8 years carrying the weight of her family's grief, understanding that her freedom had come at the cost of their peace. The question of where she belonged now, geographically and emotionally, didn't have simple answers. What emerged from their conversations was a plan for gradual reintegration rather than immediate reunion. Emma would spend several weeks in Oregon, dividing time between Portland and Millbrook, re-establishing relationships while maintaining the independence she'd fought so hard to achieve. Her music would be central to whatever came next. She'd agreed to perform at a benefit concert that Mrs. Patterson had organized before retiring, sharing her story and her songs with the community that had never stopped hoping for her return. The concert took place on a December evening in Millbrook High School's auditorium, the same stage where Emma had performed at 17 before disappearing into the American landscape. The audience included family, friends, classmates who'd graduated in her absence, and community members who'd supported the search for 8 years. Emma performed both songs from her high school repertoire and new compositions that reflected her Austin experiences, her voice carrying the weight of everything she'd learned during her years away. The evening felt like both ending and beginning, the conclusion of 8 years of searching and the start of whatever came next for Emma and her family. She'd survived her disappearance and learned to thrive in circumstances that might have destroyed someone less determined. Now she faced the more complex challenge of integrating her two identities, finding a way to be both the girl who'd left Millbrook and the woman who'd made her living singing on Austin Street corners. As the concert ended and the audience gradually dispersed, Emma remained on stage with her guitar, playing softly to herself in the empty auditorium. The melodies she chose were new, written since her return, songs about coming home and finding that both you and the place you left have changed. Linda and Michael sat in the front row, listening to their daughter's music, and beginning to understand that Emma's 8-year journey had been as much about becoming who she needed to be as it had been about running away from who others expected her to be. If stories like Sarah's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.